Yes, absolutely. So I'll do roll call and I'll kind of, David has the PowerPoint slide deck to share, and I'll be coordinating with him through this first section and letting folks chime in and converse as needed. So I'm going to go through the list I've got. So when we read your name, just say present virtually. Seth Barnes.
Present virtually.
Wendy Gerlach.
Present virtually.
And Megan Tuttle sitting in for Amanda Sullivan Astor.
Megan Tuttle, present virtually, filling in for AOL.
Thank you. David Bugney.
Present virtually.
Casey Kula.
Present virtually.
Stacy Detweiler.
Present virtually.
William Tucker.
Present virtually.
Julie Furman. She was on a moment ago. Is she muted?
He's still on, shows unmuted.
Yeah, so maybe we'll come back to her. Josh Seeds. Can't hear you, Josh.
Present virtually.
Thank you. Adam Coble.
Present virtually.
Kim Kratz.
Present virtually.
Thank you. Jason Robertson, did you get a chance to join us? I don't think so. Okay, and then coming back, Julie Furman. Oh wait, there's Jason popping on. Jason, we just did roll call. If you want to say you're here virtually. Can't quite hear you, Jason. Okay. Okay, having audio issues. Let me log back in, says Jason. Okay, so David, if you want to go ahead and start the slide deck. And go to the next slide, and then the slide after that. So for today's agenda, Stacey, are you good with me just go ahead and covering these sort of administrative items?
That sounds great. Thanks, Terry.
Okay, roll call, which we just did. We'll get to the previous meeting executive summary here in a moment. A few ODF updates, public comment. Note there's a change to the agenda, so there's no working lunch. So we're going to hopefully get to Chair Kelly well before 12:30. The roads topic, where we'll talk about context, question development, and finalizing the question. And any questions about the agenda before we move on? And please raise your hand if you have anything to add. Please raise your virtual hand, if you will.
No questions, Terry, but can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
All right, perfect. Jason Robinson's here virtually.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So just some housekeeping items. Reminder, meetings are public and recorded. These are instead of minutes, and they will be available online on the AMC website. Please turn your camera on. It helps to make it more in person. I understand that's not necessarily always possible, but that's a preference. Raise your virtual hand if you want to speak. And then when you speak, it's helpful to state your name as you talk for the recording. It's easier to identify people. So the AMC, of course, is about conversation, dialogue. And so we prefer that you minimize use of the chat during the meeting, except for sort of administrative functions, because we really want to have the dialogue amongst you folks. And then when you're not speaking, if you would please mute yourself. Next slide. So here's where we'll open it up for public comment. Stacy, do you want to say anything?
Sure. It sounds like maybe we've got one person signed up. I'm not sure if we have others, but we'll just follow kind of 3 minutes per person. If you can stick to that time, just so we can stick to our agenda and make sure we cover everything. And then if there are questions or clarifications from committee members, we'll try to take those at the end. So maybe with that, I'll turn it back to you, Terry. I'm not sure if you've got a list of folks, or otherwise, if folks want to just raise their hand, we can do it that way.
Yeah, let's do it with the raise hand function.
Okay. And I apologize if I can't see anyone.
Yeah, I'm not seeing anybody raise a hand either, so maybe we don't.
Okay.
Have public comment.
All right, not seeing any raised hands. Just pop a message in the chat if we missed you, but otherwise, I think we're okay to move ahead. And
Okay.
I think executive summary. Have folks had a chance to look through that? I'm not sure if we can pop it up on the screen real quick either, but any questions, comments, thoughts on our previous meeting summary?
David, if you would please pop the executive summary up. Looks like Josh Sheets is giving a thumbs up. It's helpful.
And can you remind me, Terry, this is not one that we vote on, right? This is just,
It's not a substantial decision.
Okay.
It's a, if people have some wordsmithing, sure, let's do that. And it's generally sort of a, kind of like Josh did, a general thumbs up.
great. Any concerns, questions? I'm seeing thumbs raised. Not seeing any hands. So I think we're good to go and approve that and move on to our next item.
Cool, thanks.
And it looks like Chair Kelly is on, so great timing. Welcome.
Yeah, we've got an ODF update here, and then we'll get to that part. This should be pretty quick. So a couple of things. So there's a DAF management program update that's going to the board as a consent agenda item for next week. I sent it to folks on the AMC this morning, and it has a preliminary. It has the big picture budget as part of that. So that's in your inbox if you haven't seen it yet. Participation grants. We're working on the process for that. We just finalized a process in terms of the grant agreements, and I'm working through getting review on that. So hopefully within the next 3 to 4 weeks, we'll get that approved. And technically that also has board approval coming for that as part of the update next week. Reminder for everyone to do the board and commission training series that was emailed to you probably about 3 weeks back. It'd be great to get that checked off your list so that everyone is on the same page with expectations on that. The question of email addresses, as you may recall, there was some talk about providing state email addresses for everyone, and it turns out that it's a long story, but that's not going to happen. So in terms of public records, it was a decision to leave that up to each individual member on the AMC how they want to tackle that. Probably the most straightforward way would be to have a dedicated email address for all your AMC related work. That way, if there's a public records request, there's a very specific and simple way to provide that. And then finally, the agreement with INR is in progress. It's just taking time between the review from Oregon State University for their side and DOJ and procurement on our side reviewing it. So it's in progress. IRST is aware that it's happening, but not as quickly as everyone would like. So just for you to know that that's the situation. Are there any questions or comments on this brief ODF update?
So Terry, the process for now, the participation grants, because I would imagine that's affects a lot of people on the committee
Absolutely.
directly. So this will go in front of the Board of Forestry in their consent agenda, and once, assuming that all flows through just fine, then is that the last sort of hurdle, and then ODF will be contacting people individually to how's, so just curious what the next steps are.
Yeah, great question. So the next step really is to finalize so we're gonna have a grant agreement with each organization. So we're doing internal review in terms of both the legalese part of it from DOJ and sort of the parts that are specific to this process. And then we'll email that out for folks to consider. And so it's probably got another 2 to 3 weeks of internal review before we send that out. So I suspect, knock on wood, hopefully within a month, those will be signed. Those will be signable, I should say, and then we can get that payment process going. Does that help?
Excellent. Yep, that's
Okay.
helpful. Thank you.
Sure. Other questions about anything on this update? Okay. Not hearing any, I think we're ready for the next item.
So I guess what, going back, if I could just quickly, Gary, to underscore that the last line there. I don't know if you're able to go back in the presentation. Yeah, agreement with INR is in progress. IRST notified of the situation. So and this is a discussion just to put a little daylight on this for the committee members. We had a discussion with Terry and with the leaders there at INR, and trying to understand when we might see the IRST engaged and ready to do a handoff with questions and things like that from us, and start to engage with the committee. And it's gonna this is sort of the last hurdle to get them starting to move. But then again, remember, they haven't even got together yet as a committee yet, and so they still need to get together, write their charter, do some of the housekeeping work before they're able to start moving forward. So as an IRST. So I think that's probably helpful. I know I was curious. I'm sure many of you are curious as well, sort of where that is at. Right now, that committee has not even met or discussed or gotten together at all. They have not been convened. And so that's still in progress.
Mm-hmm. And to add to that, a little more flesh, we're hoping that the agreement signing process goes along fast enough that they can have their first meeting, hopefully October, maybe November. And like you said, they've got a lot of pre-work to do, but we're also hoping to have a joint session with the AMC and the IRST. So but that's kind of depends on the timing and how that all plays out. But we're hoping to do that.
And just a quick comment to add on to that, Terry. It sounds like that there'll be that joint meeting opportunity and more discussion relevant in the context of these research questions, right? Because there's a lot of overlapping and interaction between all those groups. So just framing for this discussion as well, that there'll be more conversation. And I saw Casey, your hand is up, so go for it.
Hey, thank you, Stacey. To the bullet point number 4, the email addresses for AMC work. I think that I would find it helpful to hear a little bit more and maybe have some clarifying questions from your DOJ staff attorney who's assigned. I forget his name, so apologies. Obviously, the training is helpful in explaining in lay person's language the rules and the law around public records. but specifically in this situation, right, where we're public officials and we represent groups of stakeholders, I think it might be helpful to have a little bit more fleshing out of that. And perhaps I'm alone in that, and I'm fine with that.
I'd second that, Casey. I think that'd be useful.
Okay, yeah, we can work on that.
And sorry, I should have raised my hand again to just as a follow-up. I believe when we met with the DOJ attorney, staff attorney, his offer was for an executive session. And while my opinion is lacking merit, I don't think it's a good idea to have an executive session to talk about this. I think we can all talk about it in public. Thank you.
There are questions on general updates, clarifications? Not seeing any hands, so I think we can move ahead if that sounds good, Terry.
Yeah, David, if you could stop the presentation here so it's easier to see folks. And I'd just like to introduce so that Chair Kelly knows who he's talking with and who folks are representing. I'm going to go through, basically do the roll call. And if you could just say your name and what organization you represent, or I'll say your name and you can say greetings and what organization you represent. And first of all, let me introduce Chairman of the Oregon Board of Forestry, Jim Kelly. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. And
okay, thank you. I'm glad to be here and want to thank everybody right from the get-go for their service. You do enough of this and you really appreciate the thank yous and need them. And I don't envy that you're all about to start on your trainings for boards and commissions. Good luck with that. And, you know, after you've done your ethics 5 times over 5 years, what can I say? Anyhow, looking forward to meeting those of you that I have not met before.
great. Thank you. Okay, I'll go through the list again. And Seth Barnes.
Are we just present by video? Is that what we're?
No, it's for Chair Kelly just to know who
Oh,
he's
yeah.
talking with and what organization you're
Okay.
representing. That's the
Okay. All right.
You can go quickly, Seth.
Chair Kelly knows me. Oh, I see. Good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Wendy Gerlach.
Hi, Chair Kelly. I'm Wendy Gerlach with the Coalition of Oregon Land Trusts. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you again.
Megan Tuttle.
Thank you for joining us, Chair Kelly. My name is Megan Tuttle, and while I normally represent Weyerhaeuser, today I'm filling in for Amanda Sullivan-Astor as the AOL representative on this committee because she is on a lovely vacation on the Olympic Peninsula.
Great. Thank you. David Bugney.
Hi, I'm Dave Bugney. I'm a small woodland owner and a member of the Oregon Small Woodlands Association.
Jason Robeson.
Hey, Chair Kelly, Jason Robinson. I'm the Land and Resource Officer for the Cow Creek Band of Umpqua Tribe of Indians, and I'm here representing the Legislative Commission on Indian Services.
Thank you. Casey Kula.
Yeah, Casey Kula. I'm the State Forest Policy Coordinator for Oregon Wild. It's good to see you, Chair Kelly. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
Stacy Detweiler.
Thanks for being here, Chair Kelly. Stacy Detweiler. I lead the Oregon Policy Program at Wild Salmon Center.
William Tucker.
So Chair Kelly, good to see you again. Be seeing you, I guess, soon.
Okay. Julie Furman.
This is Julie Furman. I'm with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and thank you for being with us today.
Josh Seeds.
And I'm Josh Seeds with Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. I'm the Forest Water Quality Lead.
Adam Coble.
Hi, Chair Kelly. I'm Adam Coble, ODF. I'm the Forest Health Monitoring Manager.
And finally, Kim Kratz.
Hi, Chair Kelly. I'm Kim Kratz. I'm the Assistant Regional Administrator for the Oregon Washington Coastal Office, No Fisheries.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. So I'd like to switch back to the PowerPoint, and I'm going to just cover, I think it's 3 slides of sort of what's the nexus of the AMC and the board so that we're all on the same page, and then we'll open it up for conversation. Perfect. Thank you, David. So I'm going to just step through how the adaptive management process works so that we're all sharing the same understanding. The first step in the process is for the AMC to identify a research topic, which is somewhat broad, and then narrow it into a research question with some supporting information that specifies the objective and the rules or biological objectives it's testing and some other contextual information. The board may direct the AMC on research questions as well. Next. So that gets sent to the independent research and science team, and they do a scoping proposal, which sort of lays out a rough statement of work and an estimate of budget to do the work, so that this informs the AMC next decision, but it's really a sort of a first order approximation estimate of what this work would entail. Next. And so that information comes back to the AMC, and the AMC says, all right, given the different options for how long the work can take, how much cost it would be, and the level of rigor and the amount of information we get, we're going to say this is our actual research agenda, and they send that on to the board for a decision on the proposed budget on that research agenda. Next. And so that goes back to the independent research and science team who implements this research agenda. The IRST is supported through OSU's Institute for Natural Resources, and they will do a process of developing a request for proposals, RFP, put that out on the street, evaluate the proposals, pick one, manage the contract for that. And then once the research is done and there's a report, they'll make sure that there's a report for the lay person that comes, that covers some very specific points laid out in rule that makes it so that both the AMC and the board can digest what that all means. And so if you go on to the next. So they send it on that. There's 2 reports, a technical report and a report for the layperson. And both of those report results go to both the AMC and the board. Next. And so then the AMC takes that information and decides what to do, and decides what to recommend to the board. That can include status quo, everything's fine. It can include there should be a rule change because the rules are insufficient. It can be there's other policy action like training required. Next. And then it could also be there's more information needed. And then the board has a set amount of time to respond to that input, that recommendation from the AMC, and decide what if any of those recommendations or what decision to do. So that's the big picture of how the process works. Next. So there's sort of these 3 points very clearly specified in rule in this entire adaptive management process that for this interaction between the board and the AMC as laid out here. There's some other potential points for interaction between the AMC and the board, but before I get onto that, are there any questions about this process as it's laid out right here? Questions or comments?
I guess just to add to that, Terry, just kind of stepping back 10,000 foot level, our role is really to help support the board and inform these questions around fundamentally whether the rules are working or not, and whether they're meeting the biological goals and objectives. And so that's sort of the overarching frame. And we established these interactions with the IRST and with the board to support and inform all of that. But that's kind of the driving focus looking ahead. You know, we have these new rules in place with the PFA agreement. How are they working? Are they doing what we thought they were going to do? Are they meeting the objectives that we set out? So just the super big picture view of what we're doing here.
Excellent. Thank you. Other thoughts or questions?
I'll add on to that and just say I completely agree and think that the beauty of this, Jim, is that we now between both these committees with the policy or the program committee, which is more of the policy group, which is us, right? You've got the beauty here is we've got all of the typical suspects of stakeholders. We're all here, right? And we all have a role to play here in both crafting the questions, considering the research, and then considering the research that comes out and the science that comes back. And then you've got the science team. So the beauty for the board, as I see it, is really by the time things are coming back to the board, it's made its way through not only a rigor of science, but also a robust policy conversation with everyone having voices and opportunities to weigh in substantively. So by the time it comes to the board, hopefully a lot of that has taken the edges off, and we're delivering some really good actions forward at that point.
Okay, well understood, Seth. Thank you for calling me Jim. I forgot to point out that you only have to call me Chair Kelly when I'm online if my wife is in the background somewhere. But she's out of the house, so you can all call me Jim.
All right. Not seeing any other questions or comments on this process. And thank you, Stacy and Seth. Those were both helpful. There's a few more points of potential connections between the AMC. So these are some points that are not directly embedded in the process I just laid out, but if there's any issues with getting access to land to do the actual research, both the AMC and the IRST may report to the board. So this is in rule, and the board shall consider whether to initiate rulemaking or other measures to address any problems arising from lack of access to land. So that's a potential place of conversation between the AMC and the board. Annual ODF reports to the board on the adaptive management program efforts. There's like I said at the beginning, there's a consent agenda item going to the board next week. And then we're also going to have an opportunity for the co-chairs of the AMC to come to a board meeting in January and have an actual live conversation as well. And then finally, there's a sort of an obscure point, later towards the end of the adaptive management program rules, if the board directs AMC and the IRST to address issues unrelated to biological goals and objectives, then the IRST shall do XYZ, including getting the right expertise on the committee or on their review panels. So that's sort of the final aspects of this. And then any questions about this before we start to open up the floor for conversation? So next slide. So really just these are some prompting questions. Chair Kelly, do you have questions based on the presentation? Wondering, if you have status of board conversations on the adaptive management program, any other info from the board that's not in rule, and what would the AMC like from the board in terms of, board direction versus the AMC leading it? So I'm going to suggest, David, that you stop sharing the PowerPoint here so that everyone can see each other a little more easily for the for the conversation and then open it up if folks would raise their hand and we can call on you. Chair Kayla, why don't we start with you to see if you have any questions, comments
Sure.
based on what.
I think there's going to be a lot of questions and comments, but I had a couple of thoughts around process. And one is I'm assuming that most of the issues that you guys will end up wrestling with are going to be major, important ones, controversial ones. I doubt you're going to be bringing anything to us that's that will go on our consent agenda. So a couple of thoughts are around controversial issues. Timeline is tough, and so it is likely to take like a 2-meeting cycle before it is in front of the board. We have to give lots of opportunity and notice for public comment. I think it'll be important when we are at that point, assuming that we're dealing with an important issue that you guys are in front of the board there and essentially testifying and explaining. Another thought for you all to consider is I like, you guys are operating like us as a policy board, as Seth points out. You're just not, you're getting the science directly, which is great. And you guys may on these issues end up being able to all agree amongst yourselves, and you may not. I like the way the Committee for Family Forest does their presentation on issues to us. If they have not come to an agreement, they have their recommendation and they also present a minority report. And I just find that to be healthy because particularly if you guys end up, often in the same place where the same people are in the minority, it gets pretty dysfunctional, anger builds and that kind of thing. And I think it's a really healthy process. And so I strongly encourage you and if you're just barely divided, maybe got one member who doesn't agree, I don't think it's important. But if you're in places where you're just having very close votes, I think it's important that you present the recommendation and the minority point of view. I think that'll be beneficial for all of us. Those were just some initial thoughts I had. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Chair Kelly. I think maybe Terry can correct me, but I'm pretty sure that we've got minority report requirement or encouragement in the rules, recognizing that as a policy body, that there are going to be times where we're not all going to agree. And like you said, it's really important to make sure that those different viewpoints have the opportunity to be public and present and discussed. So.
And there's also the requirement in statute that for substantial decisions like these that go to the board, there has to be at least 7 out of the 10 voting members on the AMC who approve that decision. So there's not going to be a 6-4. It's got to be at least a 7-3, and there's the opportunity for minority reports.
Hey, it's good to know the legislature's way ahead of me.
There are questions for Chair Kelly from committee members? I think you kind of touched on it, Jim, but if there are things that we can do as a committee to better provide information or the right level of information, clearly showing up to board meetings, testifying or giving a presentation, I think makes a lot of sense. But if there are other opportunities or things you've seen work well with other committees, I think that would be helpful for us as we're kind of figuring things out as we go.
Yeah, sure. And obviously, there can be individual reach out to different board members. We just can't have any process ourselves that looks like we're lining up votes, obviously, with the public meetings law. But yeah.
Wendy, see your hand up.
Yeah, I put my hand up because I had some thoughts about the access in order to do our work, which I think this, being a new program, will kind of overlap with some of the new access requirements and compliance related issues in the rules in general. And I hope we'll sort of stay on the same page with those, because like in just looking at the materials we had for today, talking about how we set a good baseline and how we see how the new rules are performing in terms of considering what topics and research to look at, there will be need for some access. And we want to make sure that we're sort of on the same page with that in terms of respecting community viewpoints and making sure we can come up with an accurate baseline and data over time.
Yeah, that's been a sensitive issue in the past because, you know, in the past we had, it was something I questioned heavily because we had regular reporting on how we were doing with enforcement of the forest practices, and all access was voluntary, and which to me meant that seemed pretty obvious that those numbers would be suspect. In terms of access, I don't know where we are right now, but that is not in the board's, you know, that's any ability to have public access, and to my understanding would be any changes there would be legislative changes. I don't know. I'm not aware of any authority that we have when it comes to accessing private lands.
Yeah, Wendy Gerlach again here. I thought that in the new rules that there was more ability for compliance purposes to have access. And then
there is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then in the comment that was just made about the possible going back to the board by this committee, in case we need additional access to come up with accurate data for our reports. I think that's maybe what Terry just said. This might be too thorny an issue just to mention as a comment, but if I were to say the most general statement of what I'm trying to say is, I think access is going to be both a sensitive topic and one that we might need support on in the future to come up. Like in the two reports we looked at for this meeting, I think at least one of them, maybe both, mentioned that it's hard to get accurate information and a broad baseline and data if you can't get on properties but relying on voluntary access.
Right. Yeah. So I'm not totally up to speed where we are right now, but absolutely, you know, certainly personally, and I feel all but certain that I can speak for the board that they understand the issue and strongly support doing what's needed so that we can have good information. I mean, it's essential in my view.
Adam, see your hands up.
Yeah, just to follow up on the compliance monitoring access. As of January 1st of 24, we will have access to private land for compliance monitoring. So that's in the new rules. And then for data access, you know, we will be reporting out on you know, all of the compliance monitoring to the Board of Forestry every 2 years, and also to the services as well. But just wanted to clarify that.
Okay, good. That's great. That's what I thought.
Thanks, Adam. And I think you're going to be speaking a little bit more to compliance monitoring here shortly, which is great. So maybe we can circle back to that as well if folks have more questions.
So I would only add to that on the for help with compliance monitoring. There's a new requirement in the rule as of January 1st, and I'm sure this is being worked out in Ferns, but where it's a requirement that people will have to report back to the department on activities that were complete that year. And so no longer will ODF have to guess which, you know, and send out broad questionnaires to landowners and say, is this activity complete on this unit? Because we'd like to use it for compliance monitoring, and have to wait till those come back. And then, of course, if they don't come back because they get lost in the shuffle of everybody else's junk mail and everything else, people just don't want to get to it, then that also causes headaches for ODF. And so that won't be a process anymore.
Other questions, comments, discussion?
I guess maybe a question that I have that for sorry, I didn't raise my hand. For folks to consider is this question of how much is the AMPC looking for particular direction from the board versus the board providing that, and what was, in terms of the authors that are in the room, what was the vision in terms of how much of the whole adaptive process is driven by the AMC versus the board, and even though, and recognizing the AMC serves at the pleasure of the board, is, you know, serves to support the board. So I don't know if Stacy, Seth, others want to address that. And then, sorry, Casey, we'll get to you in a moment.
Yeah, good question, Terry. Seth and others can add on too. I mean, my understanding is that in the sort of most of the process will be through AMPC, and that's why we sort of built it with the science angle to sort of balance and inform the policy, but including that ability for the board to direct a research question and an important role for the board to play on sort of approving the funding and moving things forward in case there were times that made sense where the board wanted to step in, or it just made sense for the board to kind of direct or needed to add something based on other information more as an opportunity. But I think the intention was that most of the time it would go through the AMPC process. But again, that focus on the aquatics as well as kind of a key piece of this too, right? The overall framing of the PFA being the intention of getting the habitat conservation plan focused on aquatic resources as well. Obviously, the scope of things the board is looking at is broader than that too. Seth or others want to add on to that?
No, I think that's fine.
Yeah, I would just say, that was essentially my understanding, and I think that is the way it should work. You guys are all much closer to these issues. The board gets overwhelmed with so many issues, so expecting us to put forward what's most important at any one point is probably expecting too much.
Casey?
Yeah, it's funny. My question was really, it was going to be directed to Chair Kelly, which is, how much do you anticipate the board wanting to direct research? So I think I just heard it, but there really is, I guess, a deeper question, Chair, which is, do you or other board members, have you considered other research areas and that you'd like to have answered that we don't have as initial research topics? And I recognize that you're all very busy.
Yeah. When you ask me a question like that, there may be, I right off the top of my head, no, but it seems like things come up often, and we can talk about it. It does bring up an issue which can be a troublesome one between ODF board members and ODF itself. Is that before I was chair, I was guilty of this. Just sometimes you have a bee in your bonnet about something, and so you go and start asking questions on your own, and that can the ODF staff's very kind of fearful of ignoring a board member when they do it, but it can cause havoc when the board isn't speaking, united with a request. So just a caveat there, that if you're approached on issues by specific board members, please try to handle that as best you can, but hopefully direct it back to the whole board, and really direct it to me, because it's kind of my job to try to make sure that we're managing those communications well, and that the board is speaking as a board and not as individuals. I can just imagine circumstances where where those things could happen directly to you guys. So
yeah, thank you for that. I think the nice thing is, I think all the folks who are here also understand it and have the strong confidence to direct it back, and I really appreciate that flag.
Other questions? Not seeing any hands or anything in the chat. So I think maybe that's it for now, unless Chair Kelly, if you've got any kind of final comments or last questions for us to consider.
Oh, I don't think I have anything else. Great to see all the familiar faces, and I look forward to getting to know those of you who are not familiar to me in the future. I'm sure we will. I look forward. It's just I think what we're going to have here is a great improvement. I mean, the whole process to get to the private forest accord is just such a huge accomplishment, and so we all have a big duty to continue to make it work and find the flaws and fix them, and deal with the future challenges that we're not even sure exactly what they are. So thank you again for all your work, and I will sign off.
Thanks for being here. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks again.
You bet. All right, bye everybody.
All
David?
right. Oh, go ahead, Terry.
Yeah, David, if you could go back and then advance the next slide. So we're going to step into the next part of your process, in terms of the main body of work for today is working on the actual first question. And we've got some contextual information to get to. Stacy or Seth, there's anything before I just lay out some of this first part of information?
Yeah, I think just to kind of frame up our conversation, we had several conversations, Seth, Terry, Megan, and I, about how to structure this. And this is kind of the first time that we're tackling a research question and what would that look like and what's the appropriate level of detail to get into as this group. And I think just a few things to keep in mind, Terry, I think, is going to run us through kind of the difference between a research topic and a research question. We'll spend a little time thinking about what the rules require as far as the structure of a research question and the direction that the Private Forest Accord report already provides related to roads. And because the scope of this could get really, really big, right? So trying to hone in a little bit on what that decision space is. And we'll talk about that a little more kind of after this context setting piece too. But I guess just with that frame in mind, as we move forward, opportunity to really kind of hone in as we can, but there's also more time to kind of continue figuring this out. We mentioned at the beginning that there will be this meeting likely with INR and the IRST as they get going. And so this committee will be involved in that. And likely there will be some back and forth around these research questions in that context too. So I guess all of that is to say, hopefully we'll have some great discussion about, the direction that we have and what we still need to find out and think through, but not necessarily coming out of this conversation with a specific research question at the end of it. At least that's not my goal. If we get there, that's great, but not the expectation. Seth, anything you would want to add?
No, that was great, Stacy. I think just setting the context for, first of all, I recognize that of the co-chairs, Stacy is very much the one your co-chair to lean on as far as her understanding of the roads conversation that happened during the PFA piece, and she's very well versed on sort of what they had in mind in the studies that they put in there, and so and referenced, and so I appreciate Stacy's help in thinking through how to get the right questions. And not that we can't explore a bunch of other things too, but I think that's very, very helpful. And I think that just the context of with the expectations for today, my original thought, and I think Stacy was there too, was that we would just really dive in and tackle when we come out of today's meeting with like research questions. And in meeting with Terry and INR in preparation for this meeting, it became apparent and clear that temper that a little bit, that we're not there yet. And it probably makes sense to sort of slow down a little bit and think through. And I think that's actually useful and helpful. So don't get on yourself too hard that we have to get it all figured out today. Let's just have a good discussion and we'll let it lead us.
Thanks for that, Seth. And maybe with that, Terry, I'll turn it over to you to kind of run us through primer and some other context setting.
Yeah, so this is going to be a little bit of restating what Stacy and Seth just mentioned. But so for today, thinking big picture, we're bringing some structure to your conversation, but also remember that the policy process can be messy by definition, which means things can take a little bit of time. There isn't necessarily a linear, straightforward, simple process. We're doing our best to make it structured and as straightforward as possible. We also have INR in the room today, and they can help with IRST's role in the research question formation. So, whether you end up with a question today or at the next meeting, you don't have to have the question 100% formed. The important point is for you to have the right, figure out what you want, and then there will be a chance for dialogue with IRST and INR to hone that, to say, okay, to get to that point where this is a researchable question, and AMSI, is this what you're looking, is this going to still get at what you're looking for? So they're going to help both today as needed. The collective, you can call on them and they can jump in as well. And then this kind of comes back to what Stacy and Seth were saying, what the right balance of detail. So as you develop this, and we'll get into some more specifics here that'll flesh that out, but you really want to have enough specifics for what you're looking for to give the IRST good direction, but also know that there's quite a range of technical expertise on the AMSI. Some are very, very technically and scientifically oriented, and some are less so. And so, we could very easily get high centered on, what statistical power you need and how many sites and all that stuff. So just to be mindful of trying to get at that right balance of detail. Next slide. So really, to restate what Stacy was mentioned, the goals for today are really to hone the objective for the research, and that'll lead to the research question you're looking for. And then discussing the research question elements that are required in rule and the path to finalizing those. But like Stacy said, not necessarily your final question today. This is part of the process of getting there and even honing the process for getting there. So having said all that, that's sort of the 20,000 foot look at this. And I'm about to hand it over to Rebecca McCown from the Compliance Monitoring Group to talk about the compliance monitoring for folks to understand. But before I do, want to open it up. Looks like Wendy, you might have a question or comment. Go ahead.
Yeah, I might be jumping ahead a little bit, but when I look at like the rules, and it says that the topic is the requirement of baseline and trend monitoring of road rules. To a certain extent, this seems to be a question, but it also seems to define what our deliverable needs to be, or someone's deliverable. Is it our deliverable to come up with a proposal for how to determine the baseline and what the best way to do that is, and how the best way to do trend monitoring? It seems to me a little bit like the game Jeopardy, we're always trying to make everything a question, because I think there's sort of a deliverable in that description as well. So I'd like your comments on that, Terry, or someone else's.
I'll take a first run at it. And so no, you don't have to come up with all of the methods and the specific deliverables, you're right. The roads does sort of say, this is what you're looking for. And the AMC can choose to be able to provide a little more specifics there. But again, this is trying to get at that right balance of specifics. And Stacy, Seth, do you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I think we kind of went back and forth on which of these research topics were going to be the easiest to start with or not. And in some ways, the roads provides more direction, like you just said, Wendy. It sort of sets out a deliverable potentially, or what the goal of that close look and research is supposed to be and inform, whereas amphibians is much more open-ended. So it's a little bit tricky in that way, that it provides more direction, which is helpful, but then it kind of sets it on a track. So I think that's more the role of the IRST to really get in the proposal stage of kind of actually figuring out the mechanics of how to do that. But our charge is more, and I can speak to sort of from the perspective of drafting and working on that section, others can jump in too, but really with that goal of looking at hydrologic connectivity, how is that, are we meeting the goals for that we set in the new rules through the standards and requirements that we have, and looking to those other reports as methodologies to inform that. I'm not sure if that answered your question or leads to more questions, Wendy. Other thoughts on
Thanks,
on that?
Stacey. Wendy Gerlach again. Yeah, for me, like, it does sort of come down to whether or not we have a deliverable under this, and how to like make sure we come up with what we need to deliver. And the other issue that comes up is, since this is the very beginning of the process, I've been thinking more about the baseline, honestly, because over time, in terms of trend monitoring, we really can't do that till some time has passed. So I'll drop my comment there, but maybe it'll be useful for others to think about, okay, are we really looking for the IRST to come up with, say, a recommendation for how to do the baseline? And then thoughts on what the most effective way to do trend monitoring will be over time. So that'd be more future, because I think when we formulate our questions, we'll want to make sure if there's a deliverable in here that we do meet that.
Yep.
Yeah, that's
And so
helpful,
that'll get
Wendy.
fleshed out. Sorry, Stacey.
Go ahead, Terry.
We'll flesh out some of those deliverables from the AMC at this stage of the game, and deliverables in terms of things AMC needs to provide, and so that we'll flesh that out as we go. So totally understand your questions. Any other questions before we move on to compliance? Okay, so I'm going to hand the floor over to Rebecca Cowan from, and I'll let you take it from there and introduce yourself and your role in this.
Thank you, Terry. Can you guys hear me okay? So my name is Rebecca McCown, and I'm the riparian and aquatic specialist with the monitoring unit. Today I'm going to provide you with a quick overview of ODF's compliance monitoring. I wanted listed on this slide, I have our team. So Adam Coble is the Forest Health and Monitoring Unit Manager. Again, I'm the riparian and aquatic specialist. Kate Thompson is the compliance coordinator or monitoring coordinator. And then we have monitoring specialists, Emily Martin, John Hawksworth, Hazel Daniels, David Showalter, and Elise Chilba. We have a diverse range of subject matter experts with extensive field experience. Next slide. So under Oregon Administrative Rule 629678, the purpose and the goals of and reporting timeline of the ODF compliance monitoring are laid out. We are to monitor forest practice rule implementation and analyze compliance rates. In rule, it says the program is intended to provide information that will allow for improvement in compliance of the Forest Practices Acts through training, guidance, clarification, target enforcement, and to increase the public's trust in the implementation of the Forest Practices Act and rules. And Adam's going to briefly talk about reporting. He mentioned it earlier.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself there. Yeah, so in terms of what compliance monitoring it will be reporting is to the Board of Forestry, every 2 years a report annually to the legislature. And then part of the Board of Forestry report will also include a 8-year rolled up summary that looks at trends as well. And then we're reporting to the federal services as well under the terms of improved HCP. So the connection here, I did want to talk about the link here between compliance monitoring and AMC. And I know that part of I think it's in, Terry, you have to correct me. I think it's in rule, or is it Senate Bill 1501? I know that the AMC is supposed to.
About 1501.
Thank you. It's AMC needs to review reports by compliance monitoring program, but it's pretty vague. And so I don't know if it's worth pausing for a minute to have that discussion of what makes sense. But, one thing that I would propose is that when we submit reports to the Board of Forestry, that we also submit a report to AMC for review. And that would be every 2 years. So I just wanted to put that out there as an option. That seems to make sense. But if anyone has any thoughts on how frequently we should report to AMC, I'm all ears.
Thanks, Adam. I think I would just add a bit of context too, is we wanted to include compliance monitoring in our conversation today, just to kind of understand the differences between adaptive management and the research questions that we're contemplating compared to what Adam and Rebecca are doing and the compliance monitoring group. And it's helpful to understand those intersections as well, Adam. So thank you for raising that. There's opportunity for this group to understand and get those more frequent reports, which I think makes a lot of sense, since there's already a system and a process set up for that. And this committee would surely benefit from those as well. But maybe there's a question of, should it be more frequent or other information there? Other thoughts?
I think it makes sense to do it when you have a report, which is biannually, right? When you have a rolled up report. I see the tie-in here more as just sort of informing, as we have monitoring work that's occurring, and we may get, monitoring in terms of like, road use monitor or disconnect monitoring, stuff like that we're going to be talking about here today. It would be helpful to know what are the trends of compliance, because if there's compliance issues in a given area, and so maybe there's, training needs, or maybe there's whatever, that's just helpful context, I think, for us as we're wrestling with some other things. Other times I think it'll just be an FYI, good to know what's happening over there. But I think there will be an occasion where there's a helpful tie-in to know how things are shaking out in terms of compliance as we're looking at outcomes.
Yeah. Any other suggestions, thoughts, comments on that?
And Adam, could you describe quickly? I mean, I know for those that are not as familiar, I think there's a couple of us that also participate on the steering committee I think it's called the steering committee of the compliance monitoring program. You have your own committee, sounding board, if nothing else, that helps with that group. Can you describe that just briefly?
Sure. Yeah, I want to say there's about 15 members. And so we have representatives from industry, conservation, municipalities, OSU, university, I think. So we had set up broad groups. And so we meet quarterly, and most of it is providing updates. Right now, we're really kind of focused on building up the program from where it was. And so those meetings are open to the public. And right now. I think our next meeting is going to be in I don't have the date off the top of my head, but I think mid-September. So
September 13th.
thanks, Rebecca.
Yeah.
So I'll hand it over back to Rebecca, and thanks, Rebecca, for letting me interrupt.
Thanks, Adam. Next slide. This was actually mentioned kind of in the opening, but there are two important changes from the current rules that are really going to help with the creating a population set that's statistically sound, and that is that we will be able to have a population sample with completed notifications, and then also that landowners will need to accommodate access. So these two are major improvements for the compliance monitoring assessment. Next slide. So this is probably a refresher for many of you, but the compliance monitoring program is directed in rule to have prioritized rule divisions. So the rules that we will be measuring compliance are the forest road construction and maintenance, harvesting on steep slopes, and the water protection rules, vegetation along streams. We also can do compliance monitoring program as directed by the Board of Forestry. The next slide. So what we are doing now as part of developing the new compliance monitoring plan and program is we're going through each of the rules in those three divisions. And we are asking the following questions. Is the rule measurable? Was it assessed in past ODF monitoring efforts? Why or why not? Do other states measure that particular rule in compliance, such as Washington? Are there past issues with compliance or civil penalties with that particular rule? And then it's also, we're looking at, is this rule better assessed by stewardship foresters during pre-operations, active operations, and in post-inspection process? So we are really fine-tooth combing through these rules in terms of identifying rules that we will include in the compliance monitoring process for those three rule divisions. Next slide. So compliance versus effectiveness monitoring. So did the forest land owner follow the FPA rules? That is compliance. Does the rule meet the goals defined in the Oregon administrative rules, the goals and objectives for that division? That would be effectiveness. So I have this image here, and there's a riparian area there. So compliance would, did they have the right size buffer for the stream class and type? Would be measuring compliance. That's what we would do. Does that particular rule meet the goals set, for that particular rule division? That would be effectiveness monitoring. Next slide. So Adam actually covered this, and I'll just briefly go over it. We do have a compliance monitoring program committee, 15 stakeholders. We've met twice already, and we'll be meeting again in September. And then last slide. So this is the tentative compliance monitoring schedule. We will be looking at Rule Division 643 water protection rules. We will begin surveying in 2025 for the completed notifications of 2024. And then we will revisit that rule set again in 2027, monitoring the rules for 2026. And the reports will go out, we'll collect the data and then work with Mount Hood Environmental to analyze the data, and then the end of the year to the early part of the following year is when the report will be written or released. And then as you can see, it won't be until out years when we can start looking at trends. So if we're doing water protection rules every other year, then we can start collecting the trend data in terms of the results. And I believe just any questions is the next slide. And this picture here is of stewardship foresters learning all the new rules. So training.
Great.
Well,
thanks.
Thank you.
Oh.
Thank you.
Rebecca. Any questions for Rebecca or Adam or clarifications around kind of the difference between what the compliance monitoring group is doing versus what the adaptive management committee will be thinking about and intersections there?
I appreciate your work on this. It's a good idea to do this presentation on the difference between the two, so thanks.
Not seeing any other hands, so I think we can go ahead and move forward, but really appreciate that, Rebecca and Adam. Thank you for providing that update. There's so
Thank
many
you.
moving pieces to this, so it's helpful to know. And then I think turn it back to you, Terry, to kind of.
Yeah, so we're going to pick back up with some contextual information. So next slide. Just to revisit this question, research topics. You know, this is your decision at your June meeting. These are broad theme, such as those listed in rule that you folks. Sorry, somehow. Could you go back to the slide presentation? There we are. So these are a broad theme, and such as the three that you decide on, or a topic raised by an AMC member. And there will be a process for regularly prioritizing these. Folks, you know, certainly the prioritization will focus on both what is our near term and how do we consider, you know, what to consider later. And that process, you know, we talked briefly about it in June. We had a work group meeting on it. I took their ideas and put it together in a document, sent it to you folks. So the AMC will be discussing that at a future meeting, just not today. But an example of a research topic is, you know, looking at the impacts of timber harvest along non-fish streams on downstream fish-bearing streams. So that was one that Josh Seeds proposed, and that's sort of on the back burner to be reconsidered again later. So the research questions, these are policy questions that are going to be implemented through a research project. And so this is, you know, these will be refinements of the research topics. And this particular rule 0203 sub A has requirements, and we'll get into these a little bit more, and just shorthand calling these research question package, because, you know, it says develop a research question, but there's really these other important information that goes along with the package that you send to the independent research and science team. And I'm going to briefly introduce the concepts here, but we'll dive into them a little bit more later on. But one is the type of research and monitoring as described in rule. Another part of the package is what rule, biological goals and objectives, and or other issue is being studied. What is the objective of the research? What is the context of the research question? And what other information does the AMC think is important for the IRST to consider? So there's really this sort of suite of information that goes along with your research question that goes to the IRST to help them understand the framework, the context of what you're asking them to do. And next slide. So just to as a reminder, this is what you folks are embarking on today, is honing this information. Next slide. And really another way to think of it is, in this adaptive management process, you're at this first step. You're honing the research question and associated package before it goes to the IRST. So I'm going to pause there, see if you folks have any. Let me just pause there, see if there's any questions or comments before we move on. Doesn't look like it. Next slide. So this is information. I worked with Stacy and Seth and the PFA report to sort of provide some guiding information for your conversations around this. And in terms of the PFA report's direction on the roads issue, this is what collectively we pulled out. So there's the overarching goal, which is to ensure that all forest roads and landings shall be hydrologically disconnected to the maximum extent feasible from waters of the state. And then the purpose of baseline and trend monitoring is to establish a baseline and to monitor and report the change in hydrologic connectivity over time as the FRIA is implemented. FRIA is Forest Roads Inventory Assessment, I think is the word. And then the independent research and science team's role is to design and oversee baseline and trend monitoring for hydrologic disconnection. And the methodology shall be based off of Dubé and Martin. And note that that's based off of, not strictly follow 100%, because science is advanced. I'm sure they learn from their mistakes, and the IRST will be honing that methodology, but this provides some initial direction on the type of information to gather. And then the AMSC's role is to use the results at the end of the study to somehow I just use the results of the baseline and trend monitoring to develop regional goals consistent with that monitoring. So Dave, looks like you've got your hand raised. Go ahead.
Just a quick question. If I recall correctly, the FRIA is mainly geared toward industrial forest landowners. Will there be any connection with the road condition assessment for small woodland owners?
I guess, Dave, in the sense that the small forest landowners still need to comply with the road rules, so they're sort of in that suite under the Forest Practices Act. But as you note, I mean, the FRIA is different than the road condition assessment. Small forest landowners don't do the FRIA, but there are still standards that they need to meet and update and upgrade, particularly stream crossings and failing culverts and things like that. So to the extent that the hydrologic disconnection crossover happens, where small forest landowners still need to meet the existing new forest road standards, I think that's where the tie-in would be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I'm also wondering, would there be value in the data that would be collected from a road condition assessment, although it's not as involved as a FRIA assessment? Nonetheless, there may be some information that would help inform a policy, with regards to what exists on small woodland owner roads versus just on industrial forest land owner roads. That's what I was thinking.
Rebecca? And then Seth went off mute.
I was just going to note that in the RCA, or the road condition assessment, they do note whether they have issues, and then those will get flagged in Ferns as potential SFISH projects. So that there will be potential funding for those projects if they rank high. So just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rebecca. That might actually be an interesting tie-in in and of itself, that maybe there's something we could do with the SFISH program to gather that. But I was just thinking through that. It's an interesting question, Dave. It depends. My understanding of the new rule is that for all landowners or all large landowners, all of their roads now will fall under FRIA. And so they'll have to start, going through a process of the next couple of years. And I'm sure most landowners are already starting assessing the status of their roads and then building out sort of the framework for how they're going to address issues over time. And that will, I think, that's the baseline trend information we're discussing here today, which is like, okay, baseline being the beginning, trend being, are we seeing it actually take place across the landscape, that we're having less disconnect, we're seeing less road potential negative effects, sort of thing. But with small forest landowners, my understanding is the rule is contingent on their actions, i.e. their harvests, right? And so there is no obligation for a landowner until such a time, or small forest landowner, until such a time that they go to harvest a back, in the back 50 or whatever. And then they have to do that assessment for that road that they're using. And so as I'm thinking through that becomes pretty difficult to just sort of do any sort of blind lay over the landscape and say, let's see if this is making a difference, because it really depends on their choices in terms of when they harvest and that sort of thing. Maybe the S-fish is a way to get at it.
Yeah, or voluntary folks who want to do more of that assessment could, as part of the S-fish process, kind of get in a list of that as well. Casey, and then Kim.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question, David. I think it's clearly important to make sure that we're not comparing things that can't be compared. I would just caution that using S-fish will select for particular landowners. So this is about establishing a baseline and monitoring trends based upon how people are changing or not changing the landscape. Just caution that we're going to want to make sure that this is a group that's not selecting for the ones who want to do more work with state dollars, and caution out there. But I thought that the Martin especially laid out a nice starting point to help understand how to do this in a less biased manner.
You're on mute. I'm not sure if you were. Oh.
Sorry, I didn't hear. Hey, Terry, I have a question. And I mean, maybe this is just being naive, but the overarching goal on this slide is to ensure that all forest roads and landings are hydrologically disconnected. And the AMPC role at the bottom says use the results of the baseline and trend monitoring to develop regional goals consistent with that monitoring. I mean, the regional goals should still be to ensure that all forest roads and landings are hydrologically disconnected. Isn't the role of the AMPC to develop regional management actions to ensure that the overarching goal is achieved based on the baseline trend and monitoring? Or am I just reading that wrong?
I can jump in there, Kim, a little bit, if that makes sense, Terry. I think part of the goal with including this text, and it's really just a paragraph in the report, was to show that there was some direction and to follow that direction to the best that we can as the AMPC. But as you flagged, Kim, I mean, the role of the AMPC, and as we just discussed at the beginning, is much broader than that little sentence there says. So I think, because these processes were sort of happening in parallel, the roads chapter was being written as the adaptive management chapter was being written. We acknowledged that we needed to look and include, roads needed to be an adaptive management priority, but some of that was not as fleshed out as maybe it could be. So I think agree with you that last piece could be a little more specific. Oh, Julie, I think you want to be on mute. Seth, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a clarifying question for you, and I think maybe this is for you, Stacy. And down here at the bottom where it says AMC role, is that in? And maybe it's a Terry question. Is that in rule, or is that just in the report itself?
I'll take responsibility for this little list here, because my intention was to make it a little more clear, to try to create some buckets based on that paragraph of text we have. And I think the primer includes the paragraph. So maybe it's less useful to see these little snippets out of context. And I would encourage everyone just to look at that paragraph again. But that, I thought, spoke most closely to what AMPC should be looking at in this context. Again, with the goal of trying to understand what direction the report actually provides us there's still a lot of flexibility and space for AMC to go beyond this, to refine this, but just to try to clarify that a little bit.
Yeah,
And-
I think it is helpful, Stacy. I just wanted to make sure that I understood like what is a marching order versus a, this is a thing to think about. This is the way we were envisioning it, but it could be nuanced.
Totally. Wendy?
Hi, Wendy Gerlach here. So I'm interested in the line here that says that the IRST shall design and oversee the baseline and trend monitoring for hydrologic disconnection, which is just interesting in that it is sort of saying what work it should do, not really keyed to a specific question from us. So I just raised that in terms of, it relates to what Seth just said, is this a directive or is this more a line from the report that is more general? Of course, the statute, I think, adopted the entire report legislatively as well. So again, to me, it seems a little bit like what we're really asking the IRST to do is what's in this sentence, which is to actually, the research question is something like, how should we develop an accurate baseline and how should we use that in trend monitoring over time?
And I just popped that full sentence in the chat. So it does say specifically the adaptive management program shall use the results. So there is some fairly clear direction, but I think it's still worth thinking through that. And also and we're going to get to this, I think maybe after the break, but also looking at what the rules require and one of those things, context, biological goals and objectives, additional information that AMC might want to know. So I think as much as this is providing direction, it doesn't limit us either. We could be more expansive, I guess is how I'm interpreting that. Tim?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm a non-voting member. I'm in a little bit of an awkward situation, so you can pay attention to what I say or not. But, I'm here as part of the to help inform adaptive management with respect to the HCP, not Oregon rules, and I'm not saying anything about Oregon rules because I know that provides the legislative language to make this work. But from the NIMP standpoint with the HCP, the adaptive management is intended to explore and reduce risk to the species. And so that's the lens that I'm looking at. So that's why I'm looking for, I realize what the rule says and that makes sense, but from an Endangered Species Act perspective, reducing the risk in order to reduce the risk, it seems like you would use the baseline and trend monitoring to see whether or not there needed to be differences in the management to achieve that hydrologic disconnectivity by region, given the geological landscape or the activities that are implemented, whether it's a small private landowner or an industrial or something like that. And so maybe that's captured in this develop regional goals consistent with that monitoring. It's not clear to me. And so I'm not trying to throw a wet blanket on anything. That's just the lens that I'm looking through. So if I make comments like that you wonder, where did that come from? Ask me. But that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. I think, some of this is reflecting a negotiated policy report, right? So the language is reflective of that. And I don't think that given the language we have, we're as a committee prevented from being more expansive or considering what you just suggested, Kim.
Thanks for making
I've
me
been
feel
talking a lot. So if others have thoughts, kind of straddling a few roles here, having authored a lot of this too. So Casey.
Yeah, thank you for dancing a lot of different dances there, Stacy. And thanks to Kim for kind of helping all of us understand what our ultimate goals are with this, because that's what I hear. And acknowledging that it says EMC role, use the results of the baseline trend monitoring, develop regional goals consistent with that monitoring. As Terry showed us in the conversation with the board chair, we're going to get a report and then we're going to develop policy proposals out of it. And the stated purpose of AMC and the HCP, which are not the same thing but are together, is to ensure the survival of the threatened and endangered species and non-threatened and endangered species that are covered. So to that end, I see that the AMC's role, in addition to what's said here, is that the survivability, right? And how do we change forest practices as necessary or make them more specific for other regions? I just wanted to acknowledge that I recognize what Kim is saying, and I think that in the end we'll have a final product that comes out of this that really does reflect both what it says at the bottom of this and also goals of the HCP.
Just a quick circle back to remind everyone that the whole adaptive management program, the purpose is focusing on the biological goals and objectives that are going to be in the HCP. So yeah, that's not written on this slide, but that's sort of a undercurrent and a foundation of the whole adaptive management program are the biological goals and objectives.
I have a question with regards, and maybe it's a discussion point. It seems to me that this clearly is using sort of a regional approach or suggesting that we would do monitoring in specific regions. And I would assume that what we would be asking the IRST to do is get a big enough sample size in each of those regions to draw conclusions with a certain confidence interval that we're getting a good snapshot within each region. So it's not a rolled up statewide number, but the question I would have is what are the regions we're talking about? Because under the new forest practice rules, you have west side, east side. I don't think that's necessarily the specificity this is addressing. I think it would be more of but I don't know. So I'm asking that of each of you, like how specific is specific on regions? Maybe that's a question in and of itself that we ask the IRST. But just others' thoughts around this, or am I completely off base here and there's already regions established somewhere that I'm not aware of?
I think one element of this is what you just pointed out, Seth, the east side, west side, right? The road rules are different, east to west. So that would be one element of this. But it might be worth, I don't know, checking in with Adrian or others, if it's helpful to provide any more intention around that language. But I think it does leave the door open if it makes sense for different regions, allowing that specificity. But I don't know that I can't recall intention there beyond that.
And I know we simplified things east-west with these new rules as regarding like stream buffers and like you're saying, road rules and other things, but clearly there's a big difference in hydrology and in Astoria versus Medford. And so I don't know if there's other thoughts there. Kim's got his hands up.
I think that's a really good question. I would hope the IRST might help provide that answer, because you all know, I mean, I listened in on the negotiations for the private forest accord, and everybody reads the same literature and oftentimes comes up with different conclusions of the same data. So it seems like the IRST might be able to inform the types of studies that would be necessary based on the confidence intervals and the power necessary to distinguish geographic areas and associated costs in order to provide the answer that this group is looking for. And I think that's mean, otherwise, you, as everybody knows, you risk doing a lot of work and coming up with nothing that you can actually, the error bars are so big that it's difficult to come up with a justifiable change. And so it seems to me that the IRST might be able to help stratify the state in meaningful ways to respond to that sort of question. But my thought.
Other thoughts or questions from folks we haven't heard from? Josh or Julie, Jason? Oh, Dave, your hand is up.
Well,
Right.
just more of a comment, quick comment, really, and that's just having been involved in a lot of forest roads. They're going to be different between industrial forest land owners and small woodland owners. There could be a greater density of roads, because the smaller woodland owners have smaller parcels. They're side by side. Each wants to have their own road. So small woodland owners may have more seasonal roads than the industrial forest land owners. So those may be more prone to erosion. They may not, maintain them as well as industrial forest landowners. Small woodland owners are generally, at least in Clackamas County, closer in lower elevation, closer to urban areas, historically closer to where salmon were more likely to, to live. And so I think what I'm getting at is that if you're going to have a good baseline, then it needs to be based more than just solely a geographic distribution, that you need to reflect the different types of ownerships of the roads, the different kinds of roads, where they are, and this sort of thing, in order to come up with these confidence intervals that you want to have that you can hang your hat on.
Yeah, thanks, Dave, for flagging that. Other thoughts for now? I think we may take a quick, maybe 5-minute break and come back and dive into this a little further. I'm looking at Terry if he's, if that sounds good.
Yeah, I think that does. Sean Gordon has his hand raised.
Yeah.
Let's hear from him before we break, and then plan on breaking after him.
I was just going to add to Dave's comment on, it's a issue we faced with the Northwest Forest Plan aquatic monitoring program, is that the watersheds are broken up into a lot of different ownerships. And so it's hard to do effectiveness monitoring, if you've only got a piece of the watershed that you're looking at. So I think that's a very important point to think about, capturing all ownerships to the extent possible to really have reliable effectiveness monitoring.
Okay. So yeah, maybe let's take a break here. Stacy, how long do you want to break for?
What do folks think? Do we want to take a 5-minute break or come back at 1:50?
Sounds good.
Okay. Great. Thanks all. Hour or so. In this next hour or so, we were really hoping to, Seth, Terry, Megan, and I spent a lot of time figuring out, how best to structure this conversation. And what made sense to us was to look to the PFA report language like we did just kind of before the break. What guidance does that provide? But also, what gaps are there? What things don't we know? Looking at what the rules require. And this list is kind of a summary of that. I think you've got the OARs in the primer if you want to look at the actual rule language. But what are the things under rule that we need to include in the structure of a research question? What direction do we have from the report? Again, thinking that that is kind of a roadmap, but it could be more expansive, it could be refined. And what's that decision space kind of between those two things, so we can understand what more information we need, what questions we still have, what would allow us to get to a research question that kind of fits the structure laid out in the regulation. So that's kind of the goal for this next part of the discussion, hopefully. And again, we don't need to come out of this with a question. We may have questions about the question, that's fine. But what will allow us to get to something that we can send to IRST that meets that regulatory bar. And I think we've already flagged a couple places where we have questions, right? Like it may make sense to actually ask the IRST about that regional goals question. How might they develop and design a study that includes some understanding of, is it east side, west side? Is it, a smaller geography? And then to Wendy's point, there is kind of language that almost sounds like a deliverable in the PFA report around basically baseline and trend monitoring. So is our question really kind of focused around that? So I'll just pause there and see if Seth or Terry or others have any kind of framing comments to add. Okay. Next slide, please. So this is the actual text from the report. Again, just if you don't have it in front of you, and that's where that list kind of got pulled from. Just highlighting places where there is a bit of a roadmap for us. And then if you can go to the next slide. Oh. Yes, sorry. There we go. And then one more. So here I was hoping maybe we could just spend a little time and Terry put together some more detailed slides for kind of each of these components of what the rule actually requires, but just kind of thinking through based on what we have read and talked about as far as what the PFA report provides guidance on, what are we still missing to kind of meet these elements of a research question, the type of research, the objective of the research, other information that we might need, thoughts on other elements or questions that you all would have that we would want to consider here as far as developing a research question. Does this make sense? Trying to articulate that decision space with the information that we have and the structure that we need. What are we missing? So we've talked about baseline and trend monitoring. That's probably a type of research, and there's some direction from the report. But what else do we need to know or think about that would get us there?
I think part of it, I'll just kick off and I'll say, Stacey, I think the location or regionality question should be at least discussed amongst the IRST. I don't, unless folks can see a way to get there here, I think it would probably be best to kick that as a question to the IRST as well. And that speaks to, the distribution of the sites that they would be and how many sites that they would want to look at in different areas so that we have the sufficient power in the suggested areas. And they might give us something back that says, if you want to look at it this way, east-west, then this is the way we would prescribe it. If you want to look at it more geographically specific, then these are, geographics that might make sense. And if you were to do that, this is how that might shape up to look at, the additional sites that we would need in each one of those to have the statistical rigor to say something about that. I think that's one question.
Thoughts from folks we haven't heard much from? Oh, Casey, saw your hand go up.
Oh no, I could just drop it because of the second part of your statement.
Let's see if anyone else has any questions that are coming to mind or gaps that you see based on conversation that we've had so far. I will call on you.
This is one of the downsides of an online meeting.
Exactly. Just want to make sure that folks have an opportunity. Okay, Casey and then Wendy.
Yeah, to the question of what other, not necessarily whatever information we need, but parsing out the research question into some areas. To David Bugney's point earlier, I think a question to IRST also needs to be, can we effectively draw, or what's the research design that draws conclusions for small forest landowners and for industrial forest landowners?
Yeah, Wendy, again, I have to admit, maybe no one shares this confusion with me, but I just raise it again. It's not entirely clear to me if we are asking questions of the IRST about a project they are supposed to do, or if we have a project we're supposed to do and we're asking the IRST how best to do it, because it seems to me our objective is to have the baseline and trend monitoring. And in the report, it suggested that the IRST was just going to be doing that, in which case we might ask them questions, trying to get them focused on specific things we want in that report. Or it could be that we are supposed to ask them for work that essentially creates this baseline and trend monitoring of the road rules. So I that's all I will say for now. But to me, that very basic thing isn't clear. And in your chart, Stacy, I would think maybe we would start on the objective and then make sure that we, in thinking about how we meet the objective, we meet the requirements of the rules.
Yeah, I like that suggestion, Wendy. But to get back to your question, I don't know, maybe Terry, if you want to provide your thoughts on sort of that nuance in the process. I'm hearing you on the confusion.
Yes, that's a great question, Wendy. And so you folks are supposed to provide direction for the IRST to say, we want to know about hydrologic disconnection, and we want to know we want to know regionality's been brought up, difference in landowners, and there may be more specifics that you can say, we want to know about this. IRST, can you help do some initial design of that and bring that back to us to say whether or not that is getting at what we're looking for? And so IRST needs to, at the end of after you've developed a research agenda, the IRST needs to oversee the implementation of the research. And so you folks are providing the direction for what you want researched. Oh, but even what you want researched is somewhat of a back and forth with the IRST. So I think that may be some of the challenge you're facing right now in terms of, wait, who's on first, what's on second? So, and hopefully, Wendy, did that answer your question?
I think I'm going to wait for me to catch up with what's going on. I'll wait and see if I figure it out.
Okay, I'll let Adam and David chime in.
I'm going to ask a slightly off topic question. So I don't know if David, were you going to follow up with that Wendy's question okay. So thinking about the steps here, when I think of like the baseline and trend monitoring, it's usually fairly broad in terms of, I don't know, questions or topics. I guess I don't know if topic's the right word, but it seems like at some point that might lead to other questions that or potential studies that would be more focused, that would follow up baseline and trend monitoring. So it may be beyond 2 steps. I think that's ultimately what I'm getting at there is there could be that study could be a way to generate more specific questions.
Then my question was, is this note taking what you were envisioning or helpful?
Yes, that is helpful. We also have, if we want to kind of take it chunk by chunk or element by element, we could spend some time. I liked your suggestion, Wendy, about just thinking through the objective and the guidance that the report provides, but then other thoughts and ideas that this committee would want to include. You know, is the objective hydrologic disconnection and understanding that and where it's happening or not, and effectiveness in meeting the biological goals and objectives? Are there other objectives that we would want to dive into? But thank you for note taking. I appreciate that.
Would it be helpful to do it in that matrix or on another slide that's, you know, later on there's slides that are for each of one of those things. That's one way to tackle it. So that it's focused on that objective, for example. I think it's another couple past that.
And since Wendy, this is Casey, I didn't raise my hand. I was just thinking, since Wendy, I think maybe hasn't had her question answered, would it be worthwhile to go through that in more detail while we're scrolling through some of this? Or maybe Wendy is more patient than me.
I think I'm for some reason perceiving this process differently than everyone else, and I don't want to slow everyone down. I'm just gonna, thank you, Casey, but I'm just gonna wait and see, and perhaps it will dawn upon me.
I guess that was my way of asking, does anybody else see things the way Wendy is seeing them? And should we try to get more clarity before moving forward?
Good question. It may be, which I think Terry was kind of getting at, that slightly non-linear process where we come up with a research question, send it to IRST, there's some back and forth. I mean, I think that's hopefully we haven't finalized plans for this, but the benefit of that joint meeting in the fall is then we would have an opportunity as this group to maybe bring some draft questions in that space. I'm making that process up, but we could, you know, bring some of our questions that are less formalized to INR and IRST and have some conversation around that as well. You know, we had gone back and forth on having INR give a presentation about designing research questions and methodology in this meeting, and it seemed a little bit premature to do that because we kind of realized maybe we weren't quite ready to go there yet. We still needed to do some more of this context setting conversation, but hopefully that will happen in the fall as well. So a little bit more of a dynamic process, maybe.
Right.
So I guess maybe stepping back and just kind of big picture, you know, when we think about the changes in the road standards and implementation of FRIA, you know, large industrial forest landowners over time bringing their roads up to the new standards under the PFA that need to meet biological goals and objectives. You know, what are the kinds of things, anything that stuck out in the Dubé and Martin study or anything from the field tour that we did? You know, are they just kind of throwing things at the wall? If we've gone too narrow, zoom back out a little bit here and just thinking about, with the overall frame of hydrologic disconnection, what are the types of things that the Adaptive Management Committee would be interested about understanding how our rules are effective or not? And maybe I zoomed out too far given the quiet room.
I'll let Josh go.
Thanks. So I'm wonder, it's just kind of hard for me to understand where the AMPC's role is and what IRST's is and where the dividing line is. But so maybe some of this is going to be IRST questions, but for them to answer. But I'm wondering, are we looking at just looking for sediment laden water entering streams, or are we monitoring streams themselves, or what are we looking for? What are the actual kinds of measurements going to be taken? So like in the Trask watershed study, turbidity sampling was done upstream and downstream of where roads crossed streams. So that was like a direct water quality measurement approach. So, are we looking at a direct measurement of water quality where there's roads? And if so, is it going to be just upstream, downstream of crossings? Or would it be trying to look more, at the sub-watershed level? And then, alternately, or maybe at the same time, are we talking about, identifying places where hydrologic connection is possible or probable, and then looking there for evidence of it, like, a sediment-filled ditch emptying into the stream, or, movement of like sheet flow type movement at stream crossings going down into the riparian zone and or the stream itself. At what level are we going to be looking at it? And someone had raised earlier the geographic distribution piece of it. What's the spatial sampling approach? And then I would say we would also need to identify temporal sampling approach. Is this going to be storm sampling? Is it going to be scheduled sampling, irrespective of storms, or is it going to be a mix with sampling at defined intervals plus storm sampling? Yeah, that's all I got for the moment.
Josh, that's really helpful. Seth?
Yeah, those are good questions. And I look at some of the studies, those two studies that were sent out that were supposed to, that the IRST is basing a lot of this on, and they have some monitoring questions of their own, and some of them are around, I think, some of the pieces that Josh was just mentioning and regarding, sediment, and others were more looking at the road itself, condition of the road, what material is on the road, and then the status of the ditches themselves, cross drains, that sort of stuff. So I think, and you alluded to this too, Josh, some of this is a question. I am also a little bit murky as to whose role is what here as far as IRST and AMSI. But I think we could probably make some give some thoughts around it, and then see if they have some to add to it, or refine and come back. Because it occurs to me that we would want similar to what these other studies we're looking at. We would want to also look at multiple facets of this, as
Megan came off mute quickly. Did you want to add something?
Josh, I really like the ideas of studies that you're suggesting, and I'm wondering if you could put those and frame them up as research questions.
I mean, is this a research question? Or is that, it's certainly an aspect of a research question.
Seth,
That's
and
not
then
really
Megan?
a question. That's more of a, what is your methodology that you're going to use to answer the question, David?
I mean, as is saying a baseline study and a trend study. But yeah, that's what we're getting at, is what level of methodological specificity are our questions going to have? Whether it's we're saying these are the exact things we're going to measure, or we're going to do this structure of a study, baseline sampling, trend monitoring. Those are all different levels of methodological detail. I'll shut up and let you guys do what you're supposed to do.
No, that's helpful. I mean, it is confusing, right? And that's, I think, reflective even in the planning for this meeting was how do we kind of frame this discussion? And, I think in the primer we've listed like some key elements, right? Scope and scale, time and spatial scale of research, outcomes of the research, specific parameters, kind of like what you were getting to, Josh, around sediment. And that's what a lot of the Dubé and Martin methodology is based around, sort of sediment as a proxy for hydrologic disconnection. If you're seeing that sediment going from road to stream, you're connected, and trying to understand that over time at different scales. And I think that's why we're looking to those studies, and drafting the report as far as kind of guidance, at the time, what could inform this process, but also wanting to know, what's happened since then. Those studies are from 2009, 2010. We were hoping to bring in some of those authors to this meeting. I think that would still be great, to hear from those folks. That could be, potentially part of a package of questions to IRSTs, like what's the latest research since then? How, is sediment still the best way to measure and understand hydraulic disconnection, or are there other ways to do that type of research? Would it be, go ahead, Adam.
Just a quick fun fact, in the PFA report, hydrologic disconnection, the definition doesn't mention turbidity or sediment. So I just wanted to make that point clarification.
Yeah, thanks for that, Adam.
Adam, what does it say? You said what it didn't say, but you didn't say what it does say.
It does say that hydrologic disconnection means the removal of direct routes of drainage or overland flow of road runoff to waters of the state.
So Stacy, then is the question, how would we identify that and set it up as a research question? And one way to do that is to use sediment as a proxy?
That's kind of how I'm thinking about it. And, personally would like to understand, since Dubé and Martin, acknowledging that sediment is a proxy or a way to understand it, are there other methods or other factors that we would look at, right? Because to Adam's point, the definition isn't specific to sediment. You're talking about that hydrologic connection in the hydrologic regime. And so are there other elements of that we might be missing by only looking at sediment? Or is that still, the best available science, I guess, approach to understanding hydrologic disconnection?
Yeah, I guess I mean, as I think about it, I think both of these things make sense, right? Ensuring or measuring to see whether these rules are actually effective at getting landowners to disconnect their road systems from the streams is one element, right? And then the other element is that having the desired effect of reducing sediment. And so I think that there's place for both of those questions, for sure.
And just to piggyback on that, Seth, remember that first question has an element of gray area with compliance monitoring. Are the Is this getting them to disconnect the roads? Well, if they're not disconnecting at all, they're not in compliance. Disconnecting to the maximum extent practicable, or is that the right word? Maximum extent feasible, I think is what it says in the rule. That has some, assuming they do it to the maximum extent feasible, assuming they comply to the, with it to the maximum extent feasible, sorry. That is then you can assess the effectiveness of that. You can do the adaptive management process in that. But that first part of the question, just to note that this is a challenge. You probably adaptive management, the AMC will wrestle with, of that compliance part bleeding over into this. So just to the maximum extent feasible for the AMC to keep compliance out of what you're doing, just as a reminder.
So I do have a caution for us here as we think about, as I think about approaching this from a landowner perspective. Landowners have been following the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds voluntarily for the last 20 plus years, and so a lot of landowners are already doing this type of work, so which is a good thing, right? It means we're not starting at zero, and I know that was part of the discussion throughout the private forest accord quite a bit, and but in establishing a baseline, I guess the caution I would have for us is that if you go to a landowner that's done a really good job and is high compliant or high rate of voluntary work on their road systems, then that baseline that you're now establishing is a baseline that's not here. It's actually already elevated quite a bit. And so now, are you penalizing them for a bunch of work they've already done, and now there's like this little bit, versus another area where just so happens where you're looking at the landowner didn't do very much, and so now their baseline is truly here. And so even though that other landowner they're working on the last like 5%, they're ultimately held to a standard that's, I don't know how that shakes out, but in establishing a baseline, is there any recognition for previous the baseline already having a high standard of achievement? I don't know. I'm just asking the question.
Yeah, just to respond to that quickly, Seth, and then Will and Adam, I think that's a really good point. And I think there's some differences, right, with the Oregon Plan being more around sort of stream crossings, not exclusively, but this suite of changes to the road rules are much broader. And I guess that's where I also think about it being broader than sediment too, is things like outsloping roads and, things that maybe landowners might have done as part of the Oregon Plan, although not the focus. So yeah, I think that's a good point to how do we integrate that, but still acknowledging that there will be a pretty big change kind of across the board that I would hopefully be captured, understanding the compliance, right? Are folks following the rules? And then once they're following the new rules, are they actually getting us to the objectives we want to see? I think that's important to flag in that context. And Adam, and then, or sorry, Will, and then Adam.
So I put my hand down because this could be just of a bias, and I can't. It isn't really part of the criteria, but it's not too far from where Seth was going a second ago. As we looked at that tour, we looked at Starker, who I think of as really a leader in what they've done. And so I think about the cost to do some of these things, and some of them the cost isn't that great. The damage when you don't do it is high. But when we talk about maximum feasible hydric disconnection, is that, do rules achieve the maximum? I'm not sure that every landowner can manage their operations and do the things they need to do and achieve maximum hydric disconnection and is because of the just the sheer cost of things. So it's there's something there that bothers me. I put my hand down because I think Seth was touching on it, and it isn't time for us to talk about the expectation of this. But this goes back to my question around compliance, because I saw some really neat things done there on that Starker property that I would love to see more often. And lately I've been going down logging roads with fire crews, so I'm looking at different things lately, but I saw some really neat things done on that road system, and I'm not sure I see that everywhere I go. And so I worry about the word maximum, achieving this maximum when I'm looking for achieving a change in the result of the water turbidity and the ability for fish and frogs and other things to achieve life. We have proxies for those measures, but maximum feasible hydraulic disconnection hangs me up for a minute. So thank you. I'll just shut up for a while, go back to mute.
Adam?
So, and I think, I don't know if Terry, sorry if I'm repeating what you said, Terry, and I think you were kind of touching on this, but there's any type of monitoring that we do, there's two different, like there's what the landowners are doing across the landscape, and then there's what the minimum requirements of the rules say. And I think that those two aren't always the same, and it's really tough. What we found with Ripstream is to find like what are the results of managing at that minimum requirement of what exactly the rule says. I think we had to do some almost like a post-processing monitoring or modeling exercise to get to that question, because what's happening across the landscape, it wasn't the same as what the minimum requirements were. So just wanted to flag that to you. And that might play into the baseline. If our baseline, if they're exceeding the minimum requirements, that baseline might be too high.
Casey?
Adam, yeah, thank you. Adam, can you talk about that a little bit more? I'm sorry, that last sentence was something that I'm not understanding, that the baseline, if we're measuring the baseline in a randomly assorted sample, that might be too high. Can you go into more detail?
It could be if it's not. So if we're setting these region-wide goals, I think there would need to be some alignment with the rules. And so if the baseline is too high or too low, then it's not aligned with the current rules, which I could see some potential problems with that. I don't know, and maybe partly my lack of understanding of what baseline means or what the target is there, but that's kind of what I was getting at. I don't know if that helps.
Sure. I mean, as I understand it, the regional goals phrase is coming in the policy recommendations that come out of setting up a series of experiments and having IRST set them up and run them, commission them, provide technical reports to us. So, I mean, the baseline is across these randomly assorted areas. Here's the level of sedimentation as an example that's coming off of road systems and randomly assigned. So that's not a hey, we're doing better or we're doing worse or we're claiming to follow a different standard than the minimum. It's like, here's the physical landscape. That's how I've heard it. And however we want to define that and have IRST set up measurements for, we get to decide with them.
That helps. So it's an assessment of current conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say, Adam. That's my understanding, is that it's current condition. And that was kind of the crux of my point, saying that current condition might be much higher than it would have been if you would have started monitoring it 20 years ago, 10 years ago, because landowners have been doing work. And especially if you happen to be on landowner property where, you know, we randomly sample an area and it happens to be on a place where they've done a ton of work, then that baseline is going to be set like up here. And in order to show any progress beyond that, you're going to be dealing with the last like 2% of potential. You know what I mean? But I don't know how you get at that. Maybe it's a recognition up front within the study that there has been work, that it's not starting from zero, and that these, you know, there has been rules around directing ditch water away from streams for many years. That these new rules are just a layer of monitoring, or a layer of project work through FRIA to ensure that everyone is raising that standard, and it's less of a sort of voluntary. Not that the old rules were voluntary. You couldn't, you know, under old rules, you also couldn't deliver sediment to streams. But through the FRIA process, there's this program to achieve, you know, 100% disconnect as much as feasible, and that's different than it was before because there was no schedule with information coming in. But anyway,
Just to quickly add on to that, and then Kim, it would be interesting to see how Washington handled that as well. I imagine there's probably some similarities, and maybe that's addressed in sort of the framing of that, because I think fundamentally we're interested in, are the rules effective at achieving, you know, our objectives for sediment, for changes to the hydrology. And so to a certain extent, even if we were down here with no rules at all, you know, we've clearly had rules for decades in Oregon. So maybe we're here and now they've changed. And so what's sort of that relative difference, rather than, you know, acknowledging we're not starting at zero. Kim?
Yeah, thanks. I guess I'm not, or I'm tracking somewhat, but you know, there's no way baseline is going to be at the individual landowner unit because you can't afford it. I mean, there's no way. So it's going to be, you know, is the baseline improving over the region or over the course of the HCP? And it's kind of like, in my mind, with the riparian buffers, if the landowner increased their riparian buffers 20 years ago and their riparian buffers are 2.5 times the width that are required under the HCP, they're not going to ask them to do more. I mean, they've already met that objective. So if they already have all of their roads disconnected, there's no, I mean, you're not going to ask them, at least under the HCP, I'm not talking about forest practices, you're not going to ask them to do more because they've already achieved that quantitative metric. I think the trick is to find out what that metric is through what proxy for, you know, road hydrologic disconnectivity, and see if you can quantify that and see whether or not it's being met in some sort of a stratified monitoring plan. But again, it seems to me that those are the questions you need, that the IRST needs to respond to.
That's helpful, Kim. And I think, and maybe it makes sense to turn to some of the sample, well, not sample questions, but example questions from Dubé and Martin that maybe provide a starting point for us there, because they are looking to sediment as that proxy, and maybe are kind of a good starting point of, is this close to what we're thinking? Is this too small scale? But yeah, really spending some time to think about what that metric is. And that was kind of my question too, of, you know, has anything changed since those studies? And I saw Josh's hand and then Seth.
Thanks. Yeah, the baseline discussion, you know, so someone who's got only the hardest to manage, you know, few percent of potential connection points left to do, if, you know, for a particular landowner, if that's their baseline, do we expect them to, you know, get that last 2% that's nearly impossible when it's, you know, basically a practicability or feasibility type language in what the goal is here? So I think the baseline just tells us where we are. It doesn't really tell us by itself what has to happen, how much has to happen next. It's the baseline plus however we define the notion of, you know, what's the maximum feasible disconnection. And so I think that really points to the need to have an answer for what exactly does that mean on the landscape to the most, you know, disconnected to the greatest extent feasible, or whatever the specific language was. You know, the baseline just tells us where we are. It doesn't by itself give us tell us how much farther we have to go. We need the baseline plus we need a real definition of what is the most disconnection feasible in order to see what the actual delta is in practice. And so that might end up being a question that we need to ask IRST to help us answer. What does it actually mean to be disconnected to the most, you know, to the greatest extent feasible? Is there some kind of metrics for that? Is it just kind of a best professional judgment thing? You know, we have to have some way to define what our objective means. Or, you know, we just have a baseline that says that's where we are now, and that's you know, that's great, it's a status, but it doesn't really tell us how far do we have to go.
Thanks for that, Josh. That's really helpful. Seth and then Sean.
So yeah, I appreciate that, Josh. I do think that sort of thinking it through that way is useful. And it kind of got me to thinking, this baseline, I think we really need to get a move on to establish or figure out what the baseline across the state is, because I know landowners are already starting the process of assessing and then prioritizing projects. So in so much as the baseline is sort of pre-PFA or initial PFA baseline, you know, we really need to get this on the landscape, this sampling, like ASAP. Otherwise, we're not getting a baseline. We're getting, you know, the +1 sort of work already established. So, but if I'm understanding correctly, and I think this is useful. If it's not useful for anybody else, it's useful for me to think about this in terms of establishing this baseline. It was just a matter of asking the question of where are we at to begin with? How are we really far along already or not? And I think that's a useful question in and of itself. Maybe you all were already thinking along those lines. I guess I was thinking more in terms of baseline and trend monitoring kind of being the same thing, and you would go out and establish a baseline, then on top of that same spot you would establish the trends over time on that given spot. But I guess that's not the way, in thinking about this, that's not the way it has to be. Like, we could baseline to establish the baseline could just be in and of itself an initial study, right? To go out there in the first year and just sample all these sites. And then you could have follow-up trend monitoring, could be totally different sites. Again, you sort of just randomly sample and then see what the trends are looking like over time. And maybe that's statistically a better way to do it anyway. But maybe that's in and of itself a question for the IRST. Is it better to do a baseline study by itself, untethered with the tracking over time, and then do tracking over time as its own study as well, or do we set all this up at one time? What are the pluses and minuses of doing either?
Sean?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's you know, there's statistical approaches to that with the paired versus unpaired. You know, you have a little bit more statistical power with one than the other. I also wanted to follow up on the maximum feasibility idea, because that one, it seems, may need some back and forth, at least with the AMPC, because I think we're getting into some questions of values there that I'm not sure we can resolve scientifically.
So I guess I'm hearing interest around understanding what a baseline study could look like, if it makes sense for that to be independent from a sort of trend over time study, or if they're set up together at the same time as part of a broader package. General purpose, kind of assessing current conditions, establishing that baseline, and then understanding changes from there. As far as kind of the general type of research that we would be looking to, which is directed by the report, and I think is kind of tracking with this discussion. Interest in thinking about sediment as kind of the proxy for that, and maybe that kind of gets to the biological goal and objective. I think, you know, hydrologic regime maybe as part of that as well. And maybe there's a little more thought we would want to put towards our question to IRST around, is sediment the sort of thing that we look at here, or is it broader than that? I'm just kind of working down through the list here. The objective of the research, I wanted to come back to that because I think Kim raised some really important points around the HCP and kind of the bigger context around threatened and endangered species. And Wendy similarly kind of asking, maybe that's the place to really start, like what is the objective of our research here? And Terry, you had added the language, I think, from the rules about, you know, ensuring all forest roads and landings shall be hydrologically disconnected to the maximum extent feasible from waters of the state. You know, is that the objective of our research, to sort of understand whether that's happening or not? Do we need to define maximum extent feasible? And hearing your question, Sean, or point that, you know, that maybe has a bit of a policy element to it, what that definition is, whether it's a percentage. Other thoughts on kind of objective of this research, thinking in that bigger frame of this kind of fitting into the HCP as well as compliance with the rules. Tim?
Yeah, maybe this is a little bit of a tangent, but I don't think so. But at some point in time, it seems like we need to ask the IRST what they need from this group to determine or scale cost. Because, I mean, they can come up with something that we can't afford, which would work just fine, as opposed to something that provides the information that would be useful, that is more pragmatic and has enough credibility to have buy-in from this larger group.
Wendy, go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking, while I was listening to the various discussions, that something like is it the Dubé paper? If you were thinking, what do we want from the IRST? Like for me, after listening to this, I could imagine that what we want from the IRST would be something like the Dubé paper. So we could ask for this kind of analysis of determined by a baseline that is set by the researcher. What is the effect for HCP species over time? Is it positive or negative based on the disconnect rules? And then in the conversation we were just having, we were having a discussion of what, you know, criteria or proxies we should look at in determining whether or not it's been successful. So part of our directive to IRST, the question could be specifying what we want in terms of, or questions about the baseline, and then questions about what proxies or criteria for turbidity would be accurate.
taking notes on that, Wendy, because that was very, very helpful framing and summary of, I think, kind of what I'm hearing from all of our conversation. Other thoughts or clarifications to how Wendy framed that? So I think, David, you've kind of got a running list of our notes and comments, and we've got a running list of maybe some questions, things we want to ask IRST, things we need to know better for ourselves. And just thinking about kind of process and next steps to move us forward. We had kind of discussed in the smaller group, it doesn't make sense maybe for Terry to kind of put together some draft questions that we could respond to and kind of edit and dive into as more specifics. Another idea might be to have a smaller working group like we've done for some of these other pieces, where folks would kind of build on this discussion and some of the questions we've raised, and working with Terry, kind of again do that exercise of coming up with some sample questions. Again, recognizing we do have a bit of time. IRST and INR are important players in this process too, and we want to have their input and thoughts as we move forward. But do either of those kind of next steps for process make sense to folks, or other ideas on how to kind of take a lot of this discussion and move us forward into actually maybe something more tangible that we can kind of take a pen to and work through together? Casey?
Oh, Dave was first.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, thanks, Casey. Well, just a quick thought here is that maybe we should take a little higher level viewpoint of this and recognize that the folks that we're retaining to do the research are experts in these fields. And so, it could be more of an iterative process where we just define a simple basic question, whatever that verbiage comes out to be, and then work with them to quantify some of these more weed-like details we've been talking about, the bases of the studies and all this stuff. I don't think we need to get into that level right now, but just recognize some of the basic variables that exist. And then also just try to formulate a simple, broad question, and then recognize, is there a problem? What is the problem, and how do you solve the problem, and how do you set the baseline so you know where you're at right now and where do you need to be? I mean, that's basically it.
Seeing a thumbs up from Wendy, that makes it sound very simple and straightforward, which I appreciate.
Yeah,
Casey?
I think
Sorry.
that was a good comment, Dave, and I think that's probably sound advice. So appreciate that.
Casey, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to add, obviously tangential, but sorry, that I'm asking the group actually, would it be useful to have some folks, it sounds like you couldn't get Dubé and Martin, but to have folks who have area expertise to present to you all, so that it's not just going through a SEMA report. And then the other question would be, would it be helpful to go through some of the techniques and research methodologies that folks like Dubé and Martin went through, so that we can perhaps frame our questions up even before IRST meets, because if they haven't met yet, then we're going to be kind of waiting on them before we even, we're going to have to wait on them to be an existing thing. And so I think it would be nice to hear from people beforehand, but maybe that's just me. So to quote Stacy, temperature, or actually to quote Stacy and Seth, temperature of the room.
Yeah, I like that suggestion, Casey. We were hopeful to have, that was the initial goal, to have some of the folks involved in the SEMR process come and speak to this group, and we weren't able to connect and quite make it happen. But I like that idea too of kind of spending some time on the methods that might be useful for this group.
I mean, to be honest, they're really exciting to me. Like, is there another proxy for, for disconnect besides sentiment? How exciting.
Right. So I guess just doing a quick time check, because I want to make sure that, this is useful discussion, and if we're ready to kind of move forward, or if we still have questions we want to talk through. Do we feel like, given our conversation, that we have enough direction to provide Terry to come up with a draft? Do we like that approach? Some kind of sample questions, to your point, Dave, of like that kind of high level question. I think I really liked how Wendy kind of framed it up, determined by a baseline, what's the effect for HCP covered species over time based on the hydrologic disconnection rules. Thinking about both the sort of baseline questions and then the proxy questions, like how are we measuring this? Or do we want to create a smaller working group that focuses on this and spends a little time working with Terry? Or take a big pause, and if we're not kind of ready to move on, are there still other questions or things we want to talk through? Do folks feel like there's more conversation before we get to that stage? Wendy?
Oh, hi. To me, it seems like this topic, as it shows up in the rules, is pretty clear. So in the future, we'll be probably starting in a different place. But this one says we need requirements of baseline and trend monitoring of road rules. And we have an example of a paper, a debate paper, that's looking at a very similar situation. It's somewhat different because I think that one was done like 9 or 10 years into the Washington Act, but still it's similar to what we want to having done over time. So to me, like, those things give us sort of a level of a clarity about what we're aiming for pretty early in this stage in the process. So to me, like, maybe that's enough to go forward on without having a smaller working group, but just my thought.
Dave, sorry, I didn't see your hand.
Sure, just to reiterate, I think we've done a great job talking this subject out, and I think as far as I'm concerned, I'd be willing to move ahead.
That's my sense as well, but anyone feel differently? Okay. Casey, thank you for offering to be part of a working group. It's sounding like maybe no strong preference, or that folks feel like there's enough direction given this conversation that maybe we could ask Terry to kind of look at the Dubé papers kind of based on this conversation and come up with, I don't know, a couple various questions of different scope, or I guess thoughts from you, Terry, on what you think would make sense as kind of a next step.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's helpful to have, whether it's myself or me working with a work group, develop that package for people to say, yeah, that looks like what we want, or wait, we need more information, or no, it should be like this. So that we're starting to flesh. I think if I understand what you folks are saying, you've talked about this enough for today that the collective we can move forward with developing something for the next stage, and that would be, as I'm understanding it, this rule package of those, I think it's 5 elements. What is the type of research, biological goals, objectives, or rules? What's the objective of the research? There's another thing or two in there, but as specified in rule, start to put some flesh. And I'm not talking a 20-page working paper. I'm talking a few pages that folks could then start to mull on and say, yeah, this is what we would like to send. This is getting in the neighborhood of what we want to send to the RST, or heck no, let's revise that. But you know, and I can take everything I've heard today, and I'm happy to work with Casey and others, or, you know, so that's, to me, that's I want to confirm that I have the right understanding of how to move, of what you're looking for, and B, is it me alone or is it me working with a group? Either way is fine with me. It's up to you. So I just want to have clarity on that.
Seth, you came off mute. Did you want to add something?
I don't have not really. I mean, I don't have a strong preference either way, Terry. I think this has been a really good discussion. And so if you feel like, really, I would kind of put it to you, depending on, do you feel like you have some enough thoughts and direction here? You don't have to get anything right. Basically, I think the ask would be for you to put together a few questions to then bring back to this group, not even close to final questions, just looking at what we have discussed here, and then sort of synthesizing that as best you can and pulling out, and then bringing that back to this group to then chew on. And please don't get too attached, because I think this group will probably tear up and move around and all sorts of things, but that would help us move the discussion along. And to the extent that that's what you're working on, I tend to, you would be doing the work. So this is a question for you, but it seems to me you probably have enough here to work on without a small group assisting you. But if you think that would be helpful to have a few people, then I think we can probably get a few people together.
No, I'm happy to take the conversation today, synthesize it, and make sense of it. And yes, I'm not going to be attached, because it's really meant to be cussed and discussed and torn up, and to get, it's a vehicle to help you get to where you need to go.
Yeah, that seems like Stacy, to me, that seems like a good next step.
That sounds great. And thank you, Terry, for doing that. I just want to make sure if there's anyone who hasn't spoken up or had questions or just final thoughts kind of on this topic, I think we'll have a lot more conversation around it. But if there's anything that folks wanted to add for consideration that haven't had a chance to speak. And if not, no worries either. I think possibly we'll be able to wrap up here a little bit early. I guess the last, maybe just a quick conversation. I think it would be interesting if folks have any thoughts on the field tour and kind of how that went, things that went well, things you changed. I thought it was really great to get out and look at some of this stuff, but just as we think ahead to some of our other research topics, ways that we can improve or things that could work better or help facilitate these kinds of conversations by actually going out in the field and looking at things. Maybe if we want to just take 10 minutes or less, if folks have kind of thoughts from the field tour they want to share. Jason?
Great. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Perfect. No, I wanted to thank the ODF staff and others for the tour. I thought it was great. It was a very, I always like tours because you can actually talk and see things physically on the ground. I would say the one thing that I would improve on in the future is just at the time, we felt very, we were very strapped for time, didn't have enough chance to really have the dialogue I think we had. We had a lot of great conversations in the vans, but just adding more time to those. So if we get a specific focus area and a specific topic that we need to get out in the field on, I would just say add more time so we could really have those discussions.
Yep.
Yeah, I know Stacy and I and Terry had our own little feedback, and I would just underscore that and say we agree with you. In the future, it would be nice that we don't put a substantial decision on the same day as we're doing a field tour. but you know, it's the first one out of the gate, so we're learning.
Other thoughts? Casey?
Yeah, I second Jason's observations, and thank you to everybody who organized it. Really appreciate it. I recall, it seems like a long time ago now, so forgive me if I'm not recalling all these things correctly, but I do recall a lot of conversations about compliance with the Forest Practices Act. And I think it's hard to I was really appreciated Rebecca McCown's observation, and like, here's what, you know, effectiveness of the rules is, and here's what compliance is for individual landowners. Thank you for framing that up. But I think it's hard to look at a specific place and be like, oh, I'm not going to comment on this, because it's really impossible to not comment on a specific when we're thinking about effectiveness across a rural category and across a landscape. You know, we spent a lot of airtime on effectiveness, or sorry, compliance, and whether they're the most amazing thing ever and whether anybody can afford it. And I'd love to get us to focus more on, you know, are people following the rule in a way that promotes across the landscape? So that's my only, just, hey, next time, can we do this? But thank you all.
Thanks, Casey. That's helpful. Other thoughts, ideas? Okay. Not seeing any other hands, but definitely feel free to let us know if you've got other ideas. Hopefully we'll be able to make that a more regular thing, get out in the field for some of these issues, and always want to make them better. But thanks to the staff in particular for pulling that off. It was a lot. I think that those are kind of the key parts of our agenda here, unless, Terry, if I'm missing something that we wanted to cover at the end.
Just a question of September, all hybrid, I mean, all virtual versus in person, like we had been doing. Just to, if you want to discuss that, or leave that up to the co-chairs, or what do you want to do with that?
Yeah, thoughts on virtual, in person, mix of both?
Wendy here. I feel like it does add something to see each other in person. I like seeing all of you in the same room, even though I say that with that takes like 3 hours out of your day extra. So sympathetic to that too.
Julie, and then Dave.
Yeah, I'm going to say something similar, that I can be present in person next time and prefer to have that as an option if we can.
Dave?
I like the mix personally. You know, it's about a 2-hour drive each way for me, so it's handy to be able to break it up. I mean, I love being with everybody because you're all cool, but it's sometimes fun just to, you know, be home too.
So my only caution with the mix with the media, like, I get that we're gonna have, and I think there's always gonna have to be a mix, because there are people that just can't be in person but could be if we could make it if we can make the Zoom an option. And I think that's great that we can do that. My only caution with making each one be a mix is that sometimes what ends up happening is if you take the initiative to drive the 2 hours to a given meeting and it's advertised as mixed, just choose what you want, and neither way is emphasized, then you may have driven 2 hours and you're the only participant. And then your sacrifice is for nothing, really. And that's not cool when you're that person. And so I like having meetings where this one is emphasized in person. If you can't make it, Zoom's still an option, but please, if you can, make it in person versus, look, guys, this one's mostly virtual or all virtual, but if you need us here, there's a place here in ODF, you can come and participate in the meeting. I think that makes more sense and takes away from the likelihood of people, really breaking their back to get here, and then nobody else does.
Josh?
Yeah, I prefer in person, but I think it's good to have a hybrid option in case people can't show up. But I definitely like seeing people's faces, and feel like I get more out of it by having as many of us in the room together as possible. And I totally get it. It's like this is what David said about the drive time. It's a couple hours for me each way too, but I make a day out of it, and it seems to work out. If I just don't worry about the traffic too much.
So I don't know that we've set our September agenda, but to get back to your question, Terry, do folks have a preference? In person or virtual?
Wendy here. I agreed with what Seth said. It'd be kind of nice if meetings were designated as primarily in person, but of course, if you really can't do it, you can be virtual, or just say that it's intended that it be virtual. So that struck me as a good balance. And it's also helpful if maybe if Terry gets indications for people that even though it's primarily in person in theory, that no one can make it, he could let us know to avoid the problem of the one person who drives the whole way in just to be the only person, only member in the room.
Dave, and then Jason?
I think in person would be great. We had this one as virtual. I've been on other committees or on other committees where we alternate between in person and virtual, and that seems to work. So, something like this for in person next time is great.
And my only comment was, I really like when Terry gathers kind of a poll too. If we decide we're going to do it a certain way, we can get that information out to the group. Like, this was great. How's everyone feel about our virtual meeting? Good information. We all shared that, and then everybody knows. So it kind of helps. I agree, Seth. It's kind of you're there. You're one of three. Everyone else is virtual. It helps with that. So, Terry, I like the way that you do that. So if there's specific topics that make sense virtual and we can do that, great. If there's specific topics we really need to focus down in person, I think having that as still having a hybrid approach if we need to, but having as a focus makes sense too.
And just to piggyback on that, thank you, Jason. To piggyback on that, we're hoping to have IRST's first meeting have a joint session. Part of IRST's first meeting have a joint session with the AMC, and knock on wood, that'll be end of October, assuming we can get the agreement / contract with INR in place in time. So just that's one consideration. The other thing is, I like Seth's idea. Some meetings are more important to do in person, especially things like substantial decisions probably are. And so there isn't necessarily a substantial decision next time. You could choose to have a substantial decision if you're ready to decide on the roads, but it kind of, my sense is you might not be there next time, and maybe you want to decide on the research questions in series or as a package. I'd probably suggest in series, but so anyways, just those are all considerations. Hand it back to Stacy and Seth.
So would the October AMC meeting then include INR and IRST, or would that be a separate meeting?
It would include, I would try and, this is all a draft idea. I'm hoping that the INR and IRST can schedule theirs enough in advance so that it overlaps in time with the AMC, just because scheduling U12 folks plus the 5 from the IRST seems like, worse than herding cats. If we just have to try and bring their schedule together. Having said all that, I also can't guarantee A, that we'll have the contract in place in time, and B, that they can all make October or whatever it is, 23rd-ish. So those are a little bit of a, it seems like that should be doable this far out, but that's remains to be seen.
I was going to suggest maybe that one seems important if we could be in person in October, maybe September, if this is sort of a similar, again, we haven't set our agenda, but not expecting a substantial decision or a vote on anything at the next meeting, that would be virtual. But maybe we need to think through the agenda a little bit more and send out a note to the group and kind of get some feedback. I'm hearing definite interest in person when we can, pick one or the other, and would like to have a few that are virtual, maybe when it's a little more conversational. We're not expecting a vote, just to kind of, for folks who travel, giving a little understanding of flexibility there. Casey.
Yeah, thank you. So it sounds like we're not expecting to make a decision about sending research questions to IRST then at our next meeting, or as a result of our next meeting. Is that what I'm hearing? But it sounds like we are going to talk about it further. Do we? I feel like at some point we had here's how many times we'll need to talk about this before, but I recognize that's a rough number.
I think that's right. We haven't kind of had our agenda planning conversation yet, but I would guess that, Terry will be kind of putting together a draft that would probably be part of the conversation for the next meeting, and whether we wanted to tackle or get some updates on the process that the working group laid out. I can't remember what that process was, my apologies, but Terry sent that around. There might be a few other things that we'd want to have a discussion around.
Might also suggest, if we're trying to deal with timing somewhat, and we have a virtual meeting, let's say the next meeting, I don't necessarily think there's anything set in stone that these meetings have to be half-day meetings, right? I mean, we could also have a situation where the next meeting, because we're not waiting for the IRST, but we kind of at some level are, and maybe it makes sense that the next meeting is a couple hours to finish up this conversation instead of 4. I just throwing that out there.
And I'm going to push back just a little bit, Seth. You're right that the IRST isn't going to be ready to take action on what you send them anytime soon. By the same token, it'd be nice if you sent them several batches of questions, steep slopes, and maybe even amphibians too, so that, come January, they've got some stuff to work with. They should be, by the end of January, they should be done with their initial setup. And so it's going to take AMSI some time to work through the different research question packages. So just
fair enough. I mean, you can push back. I was just putting that out there, that there's nothing set in stone we've kind of set a precedent with these meetings that these were going to be this way, right? But I don't think they always have to be, is the point that I was making.
Well, maybe it makes sense, because I'm not sure a clear answer is emerging right now. Let us kind of think through a draft agenda for the next meeting, and then we can send out a note hearing the general preference for in-person where we can, and that totally makes sense. And thinking through September and October meetings. Does that sound good to folks? Okay, unless if anyone has a strong Seth.
And just putting this on the record, so it's on the record. And I hear everyone supportive of the online Zoom option. I think we should always make that an option because there are members of the AMC that will struggle to be in person in any given meeting. And then the other important component is the public opportunity to join. And I think it just opens up that opportunity for them. So I think it's good practice.
Yep. Yeah.
Agreed.
It will be available publicly as well, virtually as well.
Anything else to wrap up, Terry?
I don't think so.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. Great conversation around roads, and thank you to Terry for volunteering to draft our couple sample research questions we can dig into probably at the next meeting, and look for agenda and more info on that soon. Thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, bye.